Welcome to Champion Stories. If this is your first time here, subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And now, on to today's story. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the Wildcard boxing gym in Hollywood, casting long shadows across the worn canvas where Manny Pacquiao wrapped his hands with the same methodical precision he had perfected over decades. At 45D, the legendary fighter moved with a grace that defied time, his muscles still responding to the rhythm of training that had become as natural as breathing. Freddie Roach watched from the corner, his weathered face carrying the satisfaction of a trainer who had witnessed greatness flourish under his guidance. The gym buzzed with its usual energy as younger fighters shadowboxed and worked the heavy bags, stealing glances at the man who had redefined what it meant to be a champion from the Philippines. Manny's phone vibrated against the bench where his water bottle sat. Normally, he would ignore such distractions during training, but something about the persistent buzzing made him pause between rounds. His longtime friend and training partner, Buboy Fernandez, noticed the interruption and gestured toward the device. The notification showed dozens of missed calls and messages. Social media alerts flooded his screen, each one carrying fragments of the same story that was spreading like wildfire across the internet. Floyd Mayweather had given an interview to a prominent sports network the previous evening, and his words were now echoing through every corner of the boxing world. Manny's expression remained unchanged as he read the headlines that painted him as a has-been, a fighter whose time had long passed. Mayweather's comments questioned his relevance in modern boxing, suggesting that his recent activities were nothing more than desperate attempts to reclaim glory that had already faded. The words stung not because they were particularly cruel, but because they came from someone he had once hoped to settle matters with, definitively in the ring. Around the gym, conversations began to shift as news of the interview spread among the trainers and fighters. Sagani, a young bantamweight from Cebu, approached cautiously, his eyes filled with the righteous anger that often comes from witnessing disrespect toward one's hero. The young man's fists clenched as he spoke about the injustice of the comments, but Manny simply nodded and returned to his training routine. The heavy bag absorbed each punch with familiar thuds that had become the soundtrack of Manny's life. His combinations flowed with the precision of a master craftsman, each movement deliberate and powerful despite the weight of the morning's revelations. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he worked through his frustration, transforming negative energy into the focused intensity that had carried him through 8 weight divisions. Freddie called time, and Manny stepped back from the bag, his breathing controlled despite the intensity of his workout. The gym had grown quieter as word of Mayweather's comments continued to spread, creating an atmosphere thick with unspoken tension. Teammates who had shared countless training sessions with the Filipino icon exchanged worried glances, uncertain how their mentor would respond to such public disrespect. Manny toweled off his face and walked toward the small office adjacent to the main training area. His phone continued to buzz with calls from reporters, promoters, and friends who wanted his immediate reaction to the controversy. The silence that followed his exit from the main gym floor spoke volumes about the respect he commanded and the protective instincts his presence inspired in others. In the quiet of the office, surrounded by photographs documenting his historic career, Manny sat and finally allowed himself to fully process the situation. The words had been delivered with Mayweather's characteristic confidence, designed to provoke and diminish. Yet something deeper stirred within the Filipino champion, something that went beyond personal offense or wounded pride. His mind began to work through possibilities, considering responses that would transcend the typical back and forth of boxing rivalries. The morning's training had cleared his thoughts, and now a plan began to form that would indeed shock the boxing world, though not in the way anyone might expect. The drive from Hollywood to his Beverly Hills home gave Manny the solitude he needed to process the morning's events. Los Angeles traffic moved at its usual crawl, providing him with uninterrupted time to think while his driver, Eduardo, navigated the familiar route. The city's sprawling landscape stretched beyond the tinted windows, a stark contrast to the narrow streets of General Santos City, where his boxing journey had begun decades ago. At home, Jinky noticed the contemplative mood that had settled over her husband. She had already seen the news coverage of Mayweather's comments, recognizing the subtle signs of hurt that Manny rarely displayed publicly. Their children moved through the house with their usual energy, Princess practicing piano in the living room, while Queen Elizabeth worked on homework at the kitchen table, their innocence providing a welcome buffer against the harsh realities of public scrutiny. Manny retreated to his home office, a space lined with championship belts and photographs, documenting his rise from poverty to global stardom. Each image told a story of perseverance, of a young boy from the Philippines who had dared to dream beyond the limitations of his circumstances. The weight of those memories pressed against his chest as he considered how to respond to the challenge that had been thrust upon him. His phone rang constantly throughout the afternoon. Promoters smelled opportunity in the controversy, sensing the potential for massive pay-per-view revenue if the situation could be escalated into another mega fight. Sports commentators wanted immediate reactions, hoping to capture raw emotion that could fuel days of additional coverage. Even old friends from the Philippines called to express their outrage and offer support. But Manny found himself thinking beyond the conventional responses that the boxing world expected. His mind wandered to conversations he had shared with his mother, Dionysia, about the importance of dignity in the face of adversity. Her voice echoed in his memory, reminding him that true strength often required restraint rather than retaliation. As evening approached, Manny walked through his neighborhood, a ritual that helped him clear his thoughts when facing difficult decisions. The manicured lawns and elegant homes represented a life he had never imagined possible during his childhood in Kibawe. Yet success had not erased the values instilled by poverty and struggle, lessons that continued to guide his choices even in moments like these. His security detail, led by the ever-vigilant Teodoro, maintained a respectful distance as Manny moved through the quiet streets. The evening air carried the scent of jasmine from neighboring gardens, a fragrance that reminded him of the flowers his grandmother had tended behind their small house in Mindanao. Those memories grounded him, connecting him to the person he had been before fame and fortune had complicated his existence. Upon returning home, Manny found Jimuel and Michael waiting in the family room, their faces reflecting concern about the day's events. At 23 and 21, respectively, both young men understood the complexities of their father's public life better than their younger siblings. They had witnessed the criticism and praise that came with being the son of a boxing legend, developing their own perspectives on how to handle public challenges. That night, as Jinky slept beside him, Manny stared at the ceiling and allowed his mind to explore an idea that had been forming throughout the day. The response he was considering would indeed shock the boxing world, but not through aggression or heated exchanges. Instead, it would demonstrate something far more powerful than any combination of punches he had ever thrown. His plan began to crystallize as the hours passed, each detail falling into place with the same precision he had once applied to studying opponents' weaknesses. By dawn, Manny knew exactly what he would do, and the certainty of his decision brought him the first peaceful sleep he had experienced since Mayweather's words had shattered the previous morning's tranquility. The boxing world was about to witness something unprecedented, something that would redefine what it meant to be a champion, both inside and outside the ring. The morning arrived with unusual clarity, as if the California sky had been washed clean overnight. Manny rose before dawn, his internal clock still attuned to the training schedules that had governed his life for over 3 decades. The house remained quiet, his family still lost in sleep as he moved through his morning routine with purposeful determination. In his home gym, surrounded by equipment that had witnessed countless preparation sessions for historic fights, Manny began working through a light training session. Each movement felt different this morning, infused with a sense of purpose that transcended physical conditioning. The punching bag received measured combinations, not born from anger or frustration, but from a focused energy that seemed to emanate from deep within his core. His longtime assistant, Herminia, arrived early to find him already dressed in business attire rather than training gear. She had worked with the Pacquiao family for over 15 years, developing an intuitive understanding of Manny's moods and intentions. Something in his demeanor this morning suggested that significant changes were about to unfold, though the specifics remained unclear. The first phone call of the day went to his business manager in the Philippines, Rogelio, who had been fielding inquiries from media outlets across Asia throughout the night. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, covering details that would have surprised anyone expecting a typical boxer's response to public criticism. Financial arrangements, logistics, and timeline considerations dominated their discussion. painting the picture of an operation far more complex than a simple press conference or social media statement. Manny's next call reached his old friend Bayani, who had grown up alongside him in the streets of General Santos City. Now a successful businessman in Mindanao, Bayani had maintained the loyalty and honesty that had characterized their childhood friendship. The conversation revealed Manny's intention to return to the Philippines immediately, but not for the reasons the boxing media would anticipate. As the morning progressed, Jinky emerged from their bedroom to find her husband orchestrating what appeared to be a major undertaking. Phone calls continued in rapid succession, each conversation adding another layer to an increasingly elaborate plan. She recognized the focused intensity he typically reserved for fight preparation, but the context remained mysterious, even to someone who knew him better than anyone else. The children gathered for breakfast to find their father already deep in conversation with advisors who had arrived before sunrise. Princess and Queen Elizabeth exchanged curious glances as they observed the unusual level of activity surrounding their normally predictable morning routine. Israel, the youngest, seemed oblivious to the undercurrents of change that were reshaping the household dynamic. By midday, news had leaked that Manny was planning an immediate return to the Philippines. Sports journalists began speculating about potential press conferences, training camps, or business ventures that might explain the sudden travel plans. Boxing forums exploded with theories about possible fight announcements or retirement decisions, each rumor more dramatic than the last. What none of them understood was that Manny's response to Mayweather's mockery would unfold in the humble neighborhoods where his journey had begun, far from the glittering venues and media spectacles that typically defined boxing controversies. His plan required authenticity that could only be achieved by returning to the source of his strength and values. The afternoon brought a flurry of packing and preparation as the Pacquiao household transformed into a command center for what was shaping up to be a significant expedition. Security arrangements, travel logistics, and communication protocols were established with military precision, suggesting that whatever Manny had planned would require substantial coordination and resources. As evening approached, the final details fell into place. Private jet arrangements were confirmed, local contacts in the Philippines were briefed, and media strategies were refined to ensure maximum impact. Yet, despite all the preparation and planning, the true nature of Manny's response remained known only to him, a secret that would soon reshape how the world understood the character of a true champion. The Philippine Airlines flight descended through the familiar clouds that shrouded Manila's skyline, carrying Manny back to the country that had shaped every aspect of his character. 18 hours of travel had provided additional time for reflection, allowing him to fine-tune the details of what would unfold over the coming days. The first-class cabin offered comfort, but his mind remained focused on the humble destinations that awaited him far from the capital's bustling metropolis. Ninoy Aquino International Airport buzzed with anticipation, as word of his arrival had somehow leaked despite careful security measures. Hundreds of fans gathered behind barriers, their faces glowing with the pride that accompanied every homecoming of their most celebrated champion. Yet Manny's expression carried none of the victorious energy typically associated with his public appearances, instead reflecting the solemnity of someone preparing for a mission of profound personal significance. The convoy that awaited him included vehicles loaded with supplies and equipment that seemed incongruous with a typical celebrity visit. Medical supplies, construction materials, and educational resources filled several trucks that would accompany his journey south toward Mindanao. His security detail, led by the experienced Wilfredo, had been briefed on an itinerary that would take them through some of the Philippines' most impoverished regions. The drive from Manila toward his home province of South Cotabato stretched across familiar landscapes that held layers of memory for Manny. Rice paddies gave way to mountain roads, urban sprawl transformed into rural communities where life moved at the pace of agricultural seasons. Each mile brought him closer to the origins of his strength, the places where hardship had forged the character that would now define his response to international mockery. His first stop came in a remote barangay outside Coronadal, where families lived in conditions that mirrored his own childhood circumstances. The arrival of his convoy created a stir among residents who recognized the distinctive features of the man who had carried their hopes to boxing's highest stages. Children emerged from simple homes, their eyes wide with wonder at seeing their hero in person rather than on television screens. Manny stepped from his vehicle wearing simple clothes, rather than the designer suits that characterized his public appearances in America. His feet touched the same red earth that had supported his earliest steps toward greatness, grounding him in the reality that success had never allowed him to forget. The authenticity of this moment stood in stark contrast to the manufactured drama of boxing promotion and media spectacles. Local officials who had been contacted in advance watched in amazement as Manny began personally overseeing the distribution of supplies his team had brought. Medical equipment was delivered to a small clinic that had operated without adequate resources for months. Educational materials found their way to a school where teachers had been using outdated textbooks and insufficient supplies to educate the next generation. What struck observers most profoundly was the complete absence of cameras or media documentation. This was not a publicity stunt designed to generate positive headlines or social media content. Instead, it represented something far more authentic. A man returning to his roots to demonstrate the values that had sustained him throughout his journey from poverty to global recognition. As word spread through the community about the nature of his visit, residents began to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented. This was not the typical celebrity charity appearance with orchestrated photo opportunities and scripted interactions. Manny moved among them with the natural ease of someone who belonged, sharing meals prepared by local families and listening to stories that echoed his own early struggles. The boxing world remained unaware of these developments, still focused on speculation about potential press conferences or fight announcements. Meanwhile, in the remote corners of the Philippines, a different kind of response was taking shape, one that would indeed shock the sporting world when its full scope finally became apparent. 3 days into his journey through the remote provinces, Manny's convoy arrived in General Santos City as the sun cast its golden light across the harbor where his father had once worked, loading fish onto cargo trucks. The familiar sights and sounds of his hometown triggered a flood of memories that seemed to intensify his resolve rather than soften it. Street vendors recognized him immediately, but something in his demeanor discouraged the usual requests for photographs or autographs. The local gymnasium where he had first learned to box still stood on the corner of Pioneer Avenue, its weathered exterior unchanged, despite the decades that had passed since his departure. Inside, young fighters continued to train under conditions that mirrored his own early experiences. Their dreams as large as their circumstances were humble. Manny entered unannounced, his presence immediately transforming the atmosphere from routine training to something approaching reverence. Coach Jericho, who had trained local fighters for over 20 years, watched in amazement as Manny began working with the teenagers who frequented the gym after school. Without fanfare or ceremony, the greatest boxer in Philippine history started sharing techniques and insights that would normally cost thousands of dollars to access. His movements on the worn canvas demonstrated combinations that had defeated world champions, now offered freely to kids who might never afford professional training. Word of his activities had begun to reach international media outlets, though the reports remained fragmentary and confusing. Boxing journalists struggled to understand why a fighter responding to public criticism would choose to spend his time in anonymous rural communities rather than staging dramatic press conferences or social media campaigns. The narrative made no sense within the conventional framework of sports controversies and celebrity feuds. Emil, a local radio broadcaster, had been following Manny's movement since his arrival in South Cotabato. His reporting painted a picture that defied easy categorization, describing scenes of genuine humanitarian work carried out without publicity or documentation. Medical clinics were being upgraded, schools received new equipment, and families facing poverty found unexpected assistance appearing at their doorsteps. The impact extended beyond material assistance. Elderly residents who remembered Manny as a barefoot child running through their neighborhoods now watched him distribute aid with the same humility he had displayed before fame transformed his circumstances. His success had not created distance between him and his origins. Instead, it had amplified his connection to the struggles that defined daily life for millions of Filipinos. In Kibawe, where his journey had begun in earnest, Manny visited the elementary school he had attended sporadically during his childhood. The building showed signs of decades of neglect, its roof leaking during rainy season, and its classrooms lacking basic educational resources. Teachers like Enrico and Tomas, who had dedicated their careers to educating children despite minimal support, found themselves receiving supplies and funding that would transform their ability to serve their students. What struck observers most profoundly was the complete absence of any mention of Floyd Mayweather, or the controversy that had apparently triggered this remarkable tour. Manny seemed to have transcended the need to respond directly to criticism, instead allowing his actions to speak with an eloquence that no words could match. His presence in these communities represented something far more powerful than any verbal rebuttal or social media statement. As evening approached, Manny found himself in the neighborhood where his grandmother had raised him after his parents' separation. The small house still stood, though it now belonged to another family facing similar challenges to those he had once known. The current residents, unaware of the historical significance of their visitor, welcomed him with the hospitality that characterized Filipino culture, offering what little they had to someone they recognized as a fellow member of their community. The boxing world continued to wait for his response to Mayweather's comments, unaware that it was already unfolding in ways that would redefine what it meant to be a champion. A week had passed since Manny's quiet arrival in the Philippines, and his unconventional response to international mockery was beginning to generate attention that transcended traditional sports coverage. International news outlets struggled to categorize the story unfolding across rural Mindanao, where one of boxing's greatest champions was systematically addressing poverty and neglect in communities that rarely attracted global attention. The compound he had established in Alabel served as headquarters for an operation that had grown far beyond his initial vision. Trucks arrived daily, carrying supplies donated by Filipino businesses and overseas workers who had heard fragmented reports of his activities. What had started as a personal mission was evolving into a movement that tapped into the collective pride and generosity of an entire nation. Local coordinator Ariel, a former overseas worker who had returned to serve his home province, marveled at the efficiency with which resources were being distributed. Medical missions reached remote barangays where doctors had not visited in years. Educational programs brought books and technology to schools that had operated with minimal resources for decades. Housing assistance helped families repair homes damaged by recent typhoons, but ignored by official relief efforts. The international boxing community remained largely bewildered by developments that seemed to have no connection to the sport that had made Manny famous. Prominent fighters and commentators continued to speculate about when he would respond to Mayweather's provocations with the aggressive rhetoric that typically characterized such feuds. None understood that his response was already resonating far beyond the narrow confines of athletic competition. In General Santos City, the gymnasium where Manny had trained as a teenager became an unofficial pilgrimage site for young fighters from across Mindanao. Coach Joaquin, who had witnessed Manny's early development, now found himself hosting aspiring boxers who came not just for training, but to understand the character that had produced such an extraordinary response to public criticism. The stories emerging from Manny's tour began to reach Filipino communities worldwide through social media posts and overseas worker networks. Andres in Baez, a construction worker in Dubai, shared photos of the medical clinic renovation in his home village. Roberto, a nurse in California, posted about the scholarship program being established for promising students from impoverished families. Each story added another layer to a narrative that was reshaping international perceptions of what constituted athletic greatness. American sports journalists finally began to grasp the significance of what was unfolding when Major League Baseball players and NBA stars started referencing Manny's activities on their own social media platforms. The contrast between his response and typical celebrity controversy management became impossible to ignore, forcing commentators to reconsider their assumptions about professional athletes and social responsibility. Mayweather's original comments, which had dominated boxing headlines for several days, now seemed petty and irrelevant in the context of the humanitarian work capturing global attention. The very criticism that had been intended to diminish Manny's relevance had inadvertently triggered demonstrations of character that elevated him far above the realm of sports entertainment. In the evening, as Manny walked through the coastal area where fishing boats returned with their daily catch, he encountered families whose lives had been quietly transformed by his presence. Children who had received medical treatment unavailable for years played along the shoreline. Students carried new textbooks that would expand their educational opportunities. Parents spoke of hope that had been rekindled by witnessing authentic generosity from someone who had never forgotten his origins. The global boxing audience was beginning to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented in sports history. This was not a promotional campaign or image rehabilitation effort, but rather the authentic expression of values that had been forged in poverty and refined through success. Manny's response to mockery was teaching the world that true champions could elevate themselves and others simultaneously, transforming criticism into catalysts for positive change that extended far beyond individual achievement. 2 weeks into what media outlets were now calling the Pacquiao pilgrimage, the story had transcended sports journalism to become front-page news across international publications. The Washington Post ran a feature examining how one athlete's response to criticism was redefining celebrity activism. The BBC documented the measurable impact on communities that had received direct assistance, while CNN explored the broader implications for how public figures might address personal attacks. Floyd Mayweather found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position as the narrative shifted dramatically from his original provocations. Social media platforms buzzed with comparisons between his lavish lifestyle displays and Manny's quiet humanitarian work. Boxing analysts who had initially supported Mayweather's comments now found themselves explaining why their assessment had been short-sighted, as public opinion crystallized around the stark contrast in character being demonstrated. The Filipino diaspora, numbering over 10 million worldwide thousands, had mobilized around Manny's activities with unprecedented coordination. Overseas Filipino workers from Hong Kong to London organized fundraising drives that channeled resources back to the communities he was serving. Social media campaigns spread across platforms in multiple languages, creating a global conversation about authentic leadership and moral courage. In Las Vegas, where Mayweather maintained his primary residence, the boxing community watched with growing amazement as their sport's most controversial figure found himself overshadowed by an opponent who had never thrown a single punch in retaliation. Prominent trainers and former champions began publicly acknowledging that Manny's response represented something far more powerful than any victory inside a boxing ring. Back in the Philippines, Manny's activities had expanded to include a comprehensive rural development initiative that addressed systemic issues rather than providing merely temporary relief. Agricultural extension programs helped farming families improve crop yields through modern techniques. Microfinance opportunities enabled small business development in communities that had been excluded from traditional banking services. Educational scholarships created pathways for talented students to pursue higher education despite financial constraints. Local government officials who had initially viewed his tour with skepticism now found themselves partnering with his team to implement sustainable solutions to long-standing problems. Provincial Governor Carlo witnessed firsthand how private resources, when efficiently deployed, could accomplish improvements that had eluded official programs for years. The collaboration between Manny's foundation and local authorities created a model that other regions began studying for potential replication. International athletes from various sports started visiting the Philippines to observe and participate in the ongoing relief efforts. Olympic gold medalists, professional soccer players, and tennis champions arrived quietly, drawn by reports of authentic humanitarian work that contrasted sharply with typical celebrity charity events. Their presence amplified global attention while maintaining the humble tone that characterized Manny's entire response. The impact extended beyond immediate material assistance to create psychological transformation within the communities he served. Children who had grown up believing that success required abandoning their origins now saw their most successful representative choosing to return and invest in their future. Elderly residents who had watched generations of young people leave for opportunities elsewhere began to envision possibilities for local development and growth. Major television networks dispatched documentary crews to capture the unfolding story, recognizing that they were witnessing a paradigm shift in how public figures could respond to criticism and controversy. The footage revealed scenes that seemed almost surreal in the context of modern celebrity culture. A globally famous athlete working alongside construction crews sitting with elderly residents to hear their concerns, and personally overseeing distribution of basic necessities. As word spread through international boxing circles, respected figures within the sport began acknowledging that Manny had achieved something unprecedented. His response to mockery had elevated not just his own reputation, but the entire sport's potential for positive social impact. The boxing world was beginning to understand that they had witnessed the emergence of a new standard for athletic greatness, one that measured champions not just by their victories in the ring, but by their character outside it. 1 month after Floyd Mayweather's mocking comments had sparked what would become known as the most transformative response in sports history, Manny stood before a gathering that defied every convention of celebrity press conferences. The venue was not a luxury hotel or sports arena, but rather the renovated community center in General Santos City that had been rebuilt through his foundation's efforts. Hundreds of beneficiaries from across Mindanao filled the modest space, their faces reflecting the profound changes that had occurred in their communities over the preceding weeks. Children wore new school uniforms funded by the Educational Initiative. Elderly residents displayed medical devices that had restored their mobility and independence. Farmers carried crop samples that demonstrated the success of agricultural improvement programs. International media representatives who had traveled to document the conclusion of Manny's extraordinary tour found themselves witnessing something unprecedented in modern sports journalism. The assembled crowd consisted not of boxing fans or sports reporters, but rather of ordinary Filipino families whose lives had been directly transformed by the actions of their most famous athlete, Dr. Leonardo, who directed the medical mission that had provided healthcare to over 5,000 residents, presented statistics that painted a remarkable picture of systematic improvement across multiple provinces. Infant mortality rates had decreased measurably in communities that received assistance. Educational enrollment had increased as families gained confidence in their children's future prospects. Agricultural productivity had improved through the introduction of modern farming techniques and equipment. The global boxing community watched via live stream as Manny finally addressed the controversy that had triggered this remarkable month of humanitarian work. His words carried none of the defensive anger or promotional rhetoric that typically characterized responses to professional criticism. Instead, he spoke with the quiet dignity of someone whose actions had already provided the most eloquent rebuttal possible to questions about his relevance and character. Floyd Mayweather's original comments, which had seemed so significant just weeks earlier, now appeared almost comically petty in the context of the documented social impact that had followed. Social media platforms buzzed with side-by-side comparisons showing Mayweather's luxury purchases, alongside footage of Manny working in rural communities. The contrast spoke volumes about different definitions of success and significance. Major sporting organizations began announcing new initiatives inspired by Manny's example. The International Boxing Association established a community service requirement for championship contenders. Professional leagues in basketball and soccer and tennis created programs encouraging athletes to engage in meaningful social work rather than merely writing charitable donations. Veteran boxing commentator Miguel, who had covered the sport for over 3 decades, declared that Manny's response had fundamentally altered how athletic greatness would be measured in the future. The traditional metrics of championships and earnings were being supplemented by assessments of character and social contribution that reflected a more complete understanding of what it meant to be a champion. As evening approached, Manny walked through the streets of his hometown one final time before returning to his family in California. The familiar sights and sounds that had shaped his early character now bore witness to the changes his success had enabled. New medical clinics operated where none had existed before. Schools buzzed with students using modern educational resources. Families lived in improved housing that provided dignity and security. The transformation extended beyond material improvements to encompass something more profound. An entire generation of Filipino youth had witnessed their greatest hero choose humility over ego, service over self-promotion, and authentic character over manufactured controversy. The example would influence countless future leaders across various fields, creating ripple effects that would extend far beyond sports. As news outlets prepared their final reports on the story that had captivated global attention, the consensus was clear. Manny Pacquiao had indeed shocked the boxing world, not through aggressive retaliation or promotional spectacle, but by demonstrating that true champions possess the courage to transform criticism into catalysts for positive change. His response to mockery had elevated not just his own legacy, but the entire concept of what athletic greatness could represent in the modern world. Thank you for watching another episode of Champion Stories. If you enjoyed today's story, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming inspiring tales about Manny Pacquiao. Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one, and many times your ideas inspire our next episode. See you next time.